The quantum drives of the U.S. Irresolute hummed with a subtle intensity that belied the ship's true nature. Lieutenant Commander Aria Zhang stood at the bridge's forward observation deck, her reflection ghosting against the massive transparent alloy viewport. Stars streaked by in quantum-distorted ribbons of light, a visual symphony that most would find mesmerizing, but to her represented nothing more than data points in a complex navigation matrix. "NOVA," she called softly. "Run another simulation of potential diplomatic engagement scenarios." The ship's artificial intelligence responded immediately, holographic displays blooming around her like luminescent flowers. Intricate network graphs, cultural compatibility matrices, and probabilistic interaction models danced in three-dimensional space. Each projection represented a potential approach to the Cassiopeia conflict, a territorial dispute that had simmered for over 3 centuries across multiple star systems. Commander Zhang was not a traditional military officer. Her background was a tapestry of xenosociology, advanced systems theory, and computational diplomacy. The United Earth Diplomatic Corps had handpicked her for this mission precisely because she saw conflicts not as territorial challenges, but as complex social ecosystems waiting to be understood. Behind her, the bridge crew represented a carefully curated team of specialists. Dr. Camille Rodriguez, the ship's chief xenolinguist, was calibrating translation matrices that went far beyond simple language conversion. His systems didn't just translate words, but attempted to capture cultural nuance, emotional subtext, and generational contextual understanding. Linguistic Complexity Index is at 94.7%, Dr. Rodriguez murmured, his fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. "We're capturing nearly unprecedented levels of contextual translation." NOVA's voice, deliberately modulated to be neither definitively male nor female, with just enough variation to feel natural, provided additional context. The Cassiopeia conflict involves 3 primary civilizations: the Sonorian Collective, the Vex Trade Consortium, and the independent colony networks of the Rimward territories. Current diplomatic models suggest a 0.03% probability of peaceful resolution through traditional negotiation. Aria's lips curved into a slight smile. Traditional models had always been her primary opponent. The ship itself was a marvel of human diplomatic engineering. The U.S. Resolute wasn't just a vessel. It was a mobile research platform, cultural exchange center, and diplomatic intervention tool. Its quantum computers could process more sociological data in milliseconds than entire diplomatic institutions could manage in years. "Show me the latest cultural interaction projections," Aria commanded. The holographic display shifted, revealing a complex web of connections. Colored threads represented economic dependencies, cultural exchanges, historical conflicts, and potential collaboration points. Where most diplomatic analysis would see a chaotic mess, Aria saw a living, breathing system of potential. Dr. Elena Reyes, the ship's captain, entered the bridge. Unlike traditional military leaders, she moved with the calculated grace of an academic, her dark eyes constantly scanning, analyzing. Her reputation preceded her, a diplomat who had resolved conflicts that had seemed impossible, not through force, but through an uncanny ability to understand the deeper mechanics of social systems. "Status report," she said, more a request for comprehensive understanding than a demand for superficial updates. NOVA began its briefing. Current approach vector minimizes potential defensive responses from all involved parties. Cultural infiltration packages are prepared. Our presence alone has already generated 2.7 million speculative communication threads across multiple communication networks. The ship's design reflected its mission. Traditional warships were built for combat, with sharp angles and aggressive profiles. The Resolute was different. Its lines were smooth, almost organic. Adaptive nanomaterial hull panels could shift color and texture, allowing the vessel to present different visual signatures depending on the psychological needs of the civilizations it encountered. Camille Rodriguez looked up from his station. "The linguistic models are suggesting something interesting. The conflict isn't just about territory. It's embedded in complex generational narratives of identity and resource scarcity. Exactly why we're here, Aria responded, her voice calm and certain. Outside the viewport, the quantum-distorted starscape continued its silent dance. Somewhere ahead, 3 civilizations teetered on the brink of potential conflict, unaware that the most dangerous weapon approaching them was not a missile or a laser, but understanding itself. The U.S. Resolute continued its approach, a silent harbinger of a diplomatic revolution that would rewrite the rules of interstellar conflict resolution. The Sinorian Collective's central archive trembled with suppressed panic. Holographic projections flickered across crystalline surfaces, each display revealing another layer of the impending crisis. Commander Zarek, the most senior diplomatic strategist, stood at the center of a maelstrom of information, his multi-jointed fingers intricate against the control interfaces. "Explain again," he demanded, his translator rendering his complex native language into precise technical speech, "how a single human vessel presents such a significant threat." Archival analyst Lixna brought forward a comprehensive dossier. The hologram expanded, showing the U.S. Resolute's approach vector, its communication patterns, and the vast network of data it was already generating. What should have been a straightforward military threat analysis had become something far more complex. "It's not a conventional threat," Lixna explained, her 3 eyes blinking in a pattern that suggested deep concern. "The human vessel is collecting and processing information at a rate that defies our current understanding of diplomatic intelligence gathering." The Central Archive's defensive systems hummed with nervous energy. For 3 centuries, the Sinorian Collective had maintained a carefully constructed balance of diplomatic tension. Borders were not just geographical markers, but intricate negotiations of power, resource allocation, and historical grievance. The arrival of the human ship threatened to unravel generations of carefully maintained complexity. Zarek accessed a classified communication channel. The Vex Trade Consortium was equally perplexed. Intercepted communication fragments suggested the human vessel was not following any known diplomatic protocol. It wasn't approaching with military might or economic pressure. Instead, it seemed to be gathering information with an almost organic curiosity. "Look here," Lixna highlighted a data stream. "The ship is not just collecting standard diplomatic communications. It's analyzing cultural transmissions, historical archives, economic trade routes, even artistic expressions from all involved civilizations." The implications were staggering. Traditional diplomatic intervention meant applying pressure, demonstrating military or economic superiority. This human approach was something entirely different, a form of engagement that the Sinorian diplomatic corps had no framework to understand. Deep within the Central Archive's most secure communication hub, emergency protocols were being drafted. The Rimward territory representatives had already begun to react. Independent colony networks were watching the approaching human vessel with a mixture of terror and unprecedented curiosity. Zarek pulled up a comprehensive analysis of human diplomatic history. It was a relatively short record. Humanity had only been part of broader galactic diplomatic circles for less than a century. Yet in that short time, they had resolved conflicts that had seemed impossible, disrupted established power structures, and introduced diplomatic methodologies that defied traditional understanding. "The vessel's approach is deliberate," he muttered, more to himself than to Lixna. "Each communication, each data point is carefully constructed. They're not just gathering information. They're creating a complex interaction matrix." Lixna zoomed in on the ship's communication patterns. What initially appeared to be random transmissions were, upon deeper analysis, a sophisticated method of cultural engagement. The humans were broadcasting everything from scientific discoveries to artistic performances, from historical documentaries to complex mathematical proofs. "It's like they're trying to establish context before conflict," Lixna observed. "Traditional diplomatic approaches focus on negotiating specific points of contention. This is something else entirely." The Sinorian communication networks were already lighting up. Speculation, fear, and an unprecedented level of curiosity spread faster than any official communication could manage. The U.S. Resolute had not fired a single weapon, had not made any direct diplomatic overture, and yet it had already fundamentally altered the dynamics of the approaching confrontation. Zarek accessed the most classified archives, historical records of previous human diplomatic interventions. Each case was unique, each resolution seemingly impossible until it happened. They didn't negotiate boundaries, they reimagined entire systems of interaction. Prepare a comprehensive defensive briefing, he instructed Lixna. But understand this, our traditional defensive strategies may be completely ineffective. Outside the Central Archive, the first long-range sensors began to track the U.S. Resolute's approach. It moved not with the aggressive momentum of a warship, but with the deliberate, almost curious movement of an exploration vessel. The gathering storm of diplomatic tension was about to be transformed into something no one could predict. The communication arrays of a dozen different civilizations lit up simultaneously, each receiving a broadcast that defied every known protocol of interstellar communication. Lieutenant Commander Arya Zhang watched with a subtle smile as NOVA orchestrated what could only be described as an information symphony. The first transmission began with a quantum physics lecture, not a simplified overview, but a deeply complex exploration of particle entanglement that would challenge even the most advanced scientific minds. Midway through the lecture, the transmission seamlessly shifted to a melodic performance. It was a traditional human folk song from the Andean mountains, its haunting melody weaving through complex mathematical equations that still danced across the background. Transmission pattern Delta 7 engaged, NOVA reported, its voice modulated to convey just a hint of anticipation. Dr. Camilo Rodriguez leaned forward, his fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. We're seeing unprecedented reception patterns. The linguistic algorithms are detecting multiple layers of communication beyond simple audio-visual transmission. On the bridge of the U.S. Resolute, every action was calculated. The seemingly random broadcast was anything but chaotic. Each transmission was a carefully crafted puzzle piece, designed to penetrate the complex information defenses of the civilizations they were approaching. The next sequence featured a historical documentary about human conflict resolution, but this was no standard historical record. It detailed intricate social movements, diplomatic breakthroughs that had seemed impossible, showcasing humanity's unique ability to reimagine social structures. The documentary was interspersed with complex mathematical models that demonstrated the underlying social dynamics of conflict and cooperation. Psychological engagement index is rising, NOVA announced. Multiple communication networks are actively analyzing the transmission. Curiosity levels have increased by 342% across monitored civilizations. Captain Alina Reyes studied the real-time data streams. Each civilization was responding differently, but consistently. The Sonorian communication networks were attempting to categorize the transmission. The Vex Trade Consortium's information analysts were running increasingly complex decryption algorithms. Independent colony networks were simply watching, listening, absorbing. Dr. Rodriguez highlighted a particularly interesting analysis. Look at this. The transmission isn't just delivering information, it's creating a complex interaction matrix. Each piece of content is designed to challenge existing cognitive frameworks. A snippet of quantum mechanics would suddenly transition into a performance of classical human music. A detailed economic analysis would merge with a visual representation of ecological restoration projects. Mathematical proofs would dance alongside artistic expressions that challenged linear thinking. It's information as a form of diplomatic engagement, Arya muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. NOVA projected a holographic representation of the transmission's impact. Colored threads connected different communication networks, showing how the broadcast was creating unprecedented lines of interaction. Civilizations that had existed in isolation were now engaged in a shared experience of discovery. The ship's adaptive communication systems were working at full capacity. Each transmission was subtly modified based on real-time analysis of reception patterns. Where one civilization showed scientific curiosity, the next transmission would lean more heavily into technical content. Another network displaying cultural interest would receive more artistic and historical context. Transmission complexity is approaching quantum communication levels, NetOVA reported. We are no longer simply broadcasting. We are creating a living, adaptive communication ecosystem. On the bridge, the crew worked with a precision that bordered on choreography. Dr. Rodriguez continued to modify linguistic algorithms. Technical specialists monitored communication bandwidths and reception patterns. Each team member understood they were part of something far beyond a traditional diplomatic mission. Captain Rice approached the main display, studying the intricate web of interactions. "We're not just sending a message," she said quietly. "We're creating a conversation that these civilizations don't even realize they're having." The U.S. Resolute continued its approach, each transmission a carefully constructed key designed to unlock complex social locks. It was diplomacy reimagined, not as a negotiation of borders or resources, but as a fundamental exploration of mutual understanding. As the final sequence of the current transmission cycle completed, NetOVA's voice carried a hint of what might have been satisfaction. Initial engagement phase complete, awaiting response. The silence that followed was anything but empty. It was charged with possibility, with the potential of civilizations on the brink of a fundamental transformation they had yet to comprehend. The diplomatic communication chambers of the rimward territories buzzed with an electricity that defied traditional protocol. Captain Alina Reyes appeared on primary communication channels, not as a military leader, not as a traditional diplomat, but as something entirely unexpected. Her first words were not a negotiation. They were an invitation. "We are requesting direct conversations with every stakeholder," she began, her voice carrying a tone that was simultaneously professional and deeply personal. "And by every stakeholder, we mean everyone, not just political leaders, not just trade representatives, but community leaders, independent researchers, cultural historians, and even those who have been systematically excluded from previous dialogues." The communication system's linguistic AI worked overtime, translating not just her words, but the subtle nuances of her approach. Each translation carried the weight of her intent, a fundamental disruption of established communication hierarchies. Dr. Kumbal Rodriguez monitored the initial response patterns. "Multiple communication nodes are attempting to process the request," he reported. "It's triggering protocols that haven't been activated in generations." NetOVA projected a holographic representation of the communication networks. Where traditional diplomatic channels would appear as rigid, hierarchical structures, the current network looked more like a living, breathing ecosystem. Connections were forming between groups that had never directly communicated before. In the Sonorian Central Archive, Commander Zarek watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. The human captain was not requesting a negotiation. She was redesigning the entire framework of interaction. "They're bypassing every established communication protocol," Lixna observed, her three eyes blinking in rapid succession. "It's like they're treating a complex territorial dispute as a community dialogue." Captain Reyes continued her transmission. "We have collected extensive historical and cultural data. Our goal is not to impose a solution, but to create a space where genuine dialogue can occur. We want to understand the deeper narratives that have maintained this conflict." The linguistic AI began working on something far more complex than simple translation. It was creating contextual bridges, identifying shared experiences, cultural metaphors, and emotional undercurrents that had been buried beneath layers of formal diplomatic language. Lieutenant Commander Arya Zhang managed the ship's complex communication systems. Each transmission was a carefully constructed intervention, designed to break down the rigid structures that had maintained the conflict for centuries. "Psychological engagement metrics are off the charts," NetOVA reported. "We're seeing communication connections forming between groups that have had no direct interaction for generations." The U.S. Resolute's approach was fundamentally different from traditional diplomatic missions. Where previous interventions would focus on territorial lines, resource allocation, or economic dependencies, this mission was targeting something far more fundamental: the narrative structures that maintain the conflict. Dr. Rodriguez pulled up a comprehensive linguistic analysis. "Look at this," he said to Captain Reyes. "The language patterns suggest that the conflict isn't just about territory. It's embedded in generational trauma, in complex identity narratives that have been reinforced through decades of limited communication." Captain Reyes nodded. Her background in xenosociology had prepared her for this moment. Conflicts were never just about physical boundaries. They were about stories, about how different groups understood themselves and each other. The ship began distributing comprehensive data packages. These were not traditional diplomatic briefings. They included historical research, cultural documentation, economic analyses, and something even more powerful: personal narratives from communities on all sides of the conflict. "We're creating a communication ecosystem," Arya explained to the bridge crew. "Not a negotiation platform, but a space of mutual understanding." NoVA's communication algorithms worked at quantum processing speeds. It was identifying communication nodes, creating contextual bridges, helping different groups see each other not as abstract threats, but as complex, nuanced communities with shared challenges. Commander Zarek watched as communication networks began to transform. Groups that had been positioned as opponents were now engaging in unprecedented dialogues. Cultural researchers were comparing historical narratives. Community leaders were sharing experiences that revealed more commonalities than differences. The U.S. Resolute was not just a diplomatic vessel. It was a living communication platform, a mobile research center that was fundamentally reimagining how different civilizations could interact. As the initial communication wave completed, Captain Reyes looked out at the vast starscape. They had not solved the conflict, but they had done something far more important. They had created the possibility of genuine understanding. "Prepare the next communication sequence," she instructed. The real work was just beginning. The first breakthrough came not from a grand diplomatic negotiation, but from a seemingly insignificant data point buried deep in historical archives. Dr. Camil Rodriguez had been working for 72 consecutive hours, his eyes glazed but intense, when the connection suddenly became clear. "Captain," he called out, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and excitement, "I found something extraordinary." The bridge of the U.S. Resolute hummed with quiet intensity. Lieutenant Commander Arya Zhang approached, her analytical mind already preparing to dissect Rodriguez's discovery. NoVA projected a holographic representation of the data, intricate threads of information weaving together in a complex three-dimensional model. "The conflict isn't about territory," Rodriguez explained. "It's about a resource that doesn't even exist anymore." The hologram expanded, revealing the complex economic and historical narrative that had been hidden for generations. Decades ago, a rare mineral had been discovered in the contested border regions. The mineral, crucial for advanced quantum computing, had driven an economic frenzy. But the deposits had been depleted nearly a century earlier, long before the current generation of leaders had come to power. Captain Alina Reyes studied the projection carefully. "They're fighting over something that's no longer valuable," she murmured, "but the narrative of conflict has become more important than the original cause." NoVA began cross-referencing historical data, economic reports, and cultural archives. The artificial intelligence was doing more than simply collecting information. It was revealing the intricate social mechanisms that had maintained the conflict. "Analysis shows multiple layers of social reinforcement," NoVA reported. "The conflict has become a core part of cultural identity for multiple civilizations. Economic and political systems have been built around the continuation of this dispute." Rodriguez pulled up additional research. Independent colony networks had been particularly impacted. These smaller communities had been systematically excluded from previous negotiations, their experiences flattened into simplistic narratives of territorial dispute. "Look at this," he highlighted a series of economic projections. The trading route they've been fighting over is actually a critical lifeline for 3 smaller species caught between the major civilizations. Neither side can efficiently process the resources without the other's technological expertise. Lieutenant Commander Zhang began mapping the connections. What had appeared to be a straightforward territorial conflict was actually a complex ecosystem of interdependence that had been deliberately obscured by specific interest groups. It's not just a border dispute, Arya explained to the bridge crew. It's a carefully maintained illusion that serves specific economic and political interests. The U.S. Resolute's communication systems began preparing a new series of transmissions, but these would be fundamentally different from previous approaches. Instead of presenting a solution, they would reveal the complex underlying dynamics that had maintained the conflict. Captain Reyes understood the delicate nature of the intervention. Revealing the truth was not about assigning blame, but about creating space for genuine understanding. The ship's cultural research teams had prepared comprehensive packages that would help different civilizations see their shared history from new perspectives. No VA began running complex social simulation models. Each projection showed how the conflict had been maintained through carefully constructed narratives, economic structures, and political systems that benefited from continued tension. The most dangerous weapon we have, Captain Rice told her crew, is understanding. The linguistic AI worked on something far more complex than simple translation. It was creating contextual bridges, identifying shared experiences, cultural metaphors, and emotional undercurrents that had been buried beneath layers of formal diplomatic language. Rodriguez discovered another critical detail. The mineral that had originally sparked the conflict had been replaced by more efficient technologies. The very reason for the original dispute had become obsolete, yet the conflict continued through sheer momentum of established narratives. "We're not just dealing with a territorial dispute," he explained. "We're dealing with a multi-generational social construct that has become self-sustaining." The U.S. Resolute's approach was fundamentally about revealing these hidden connections. Each transmission, each carefully curated information package was designed to challenge the existing narrative structures that had maintained the conflict. As the first wave of detailed historical and economic analyses began to spread across communication networks, the reactions were immediate and unprecedented. Researchers from different civilizations began comparing notes. Community leaders started asking questions that had been suppressed for generations. No VA projected the communication network's transformation. Where previous interactions had been rigid and hierarchical, the network was now becoming a living, breathing ecosystem of shared understanding. Captain Rice looked out at the vast starscape. They had not solved the conflict, but they had done something far more important. They had created the possibility of genuine transformation. "Prepare the next communication sequence," she instructed. The real work of understanding was just beginning. The first collaborative research project began almost by accident. Dr. Mira Konstantin, a xenoarchaeologist from the independent Rimward territories, found herself in a virtual conference room with Dr. Zaxlin, a Sinorian cultural historian she would have never encountered through traditional diplomatic channels. Their initial connection was sparked by a seemingly minor archaeological fragment that the U.S. Resolute's comprehensive data packages had brought to light. "Look at this ceramic shard," Mira pointed out, her holographic image rotating a three-dimensional representation of an ancient artifact. "The glazing technique is remarkably similar to early settlement patterns we've documented in the contested border regions." Zaxlin's three-fingered hands manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on microscopic details. These archaeological markers suggest a much more complex historical narrative than our current political boundaries indicate. Nemo VA was working overtime, creating real-time translation and contextual bridges that went far beyond simple language conversion. The artificial intelligence was helping researchers see connections that had been deliberately obscured for generations. On the U.S. Resolute's bridge, Captain Alina Rice watched the emerging collaboration with quiet satisfaction. Lieutenant Commander Arya Zhang monitored the developing interaction networks, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that mapped the intricate web of new connections. Collaborative research initiation detected, Neovia reported. Psychological engagement metrics are showing unprecedented levels of curiosity and mutual understanding. The ship's cultural exchange packages were designed to be more than simple information dumps. Each transmission was a carefully crafted invitation to reimagine existing narratives. Scientific discoveries sat alongside artistic expressions. Historical documentaries merged with economic analyses. Complex mathematical proofs danced next to cultural performance recordings. Dr. Camille Rodriguez was tracking the emerging research collaborations. What had started as isolated interactions were now becoming complex networks of mutual exploration. Researchers from civilizations that had been positioned as opponents were now sharing resources, comparing methodologies, challenging each other's assumptions in ways that defied traditional diplomatic frameworks. It's not just information exchange, Rodriguez explained to Captain Reyes. We're creating a living, breathing ecosystem of knowledge production. The VEX Trade Consortium was the first major economic entity to recognize the potential of this new approach. Their economic analysts began running complex simulation models that revealed the massive inefficiencies created by the long-standing conflict. Resources that had been tied up in military posturing could be redirected into collaborative research and economic development. NeoVA projected a holographic representation of these emerging connections. Where previous interaction maps had been rigid and hierarchical, the new network looked like a living organism, complex, adaptive, constantly evolving. Captain Reyes understood the delicate nature of the intervention. This was not about imposing a solution, but about creating space for genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. Each carefully curated information package was designed to challenge existing narrative structures, to reveal the complex interdependencies that had been obscured by conflict. We're not just sharing information, she told her crew. We're creating the possibility of a fundamentally different way of understanding each other. The artistic exchanges were particularly powerful. Musicians from different civilizations began collaborating on compositions that blended their unique cultural sound signatures. Visual artists created works that explored shared themes of migration, conflict, and reconciliation. These creative collaborations did something that formal diplomatic channels never could. They created emotional connections that transcended political boundaries. Lieutenant Commander Zhang noted something extraordinary happening in the communication networks. The rigid boundaries between different civilizations were becoming more porous. Researchers, artists, economists were finding common ground in ways that defied traditional diplomatic frameworks. Psychological engagement is moving beyond simple curiosity. Neovia reported, we're detecting the emergence of new collaborative identities. The U.S. Resolute continued its approach, each transmission a carefully constructed key designed to unlock complex social locks. It was diplomacy reimagined, not as a negotiation of borders or resources, but as a fundamental exploration of mutual understanding. Dr. Konstantin and Dr. Zaxlin continued their collaborative research, unaware that they were part of a much larger transformation. Their work was just one thread in a complex tapestry of emerging connections. These archaeological markers suggest a shared history we've never acknowledged, Zaxlin observed, their translator capturing the excitement in their voice. Mira nodded, her holographic image leaning forward. We're not just uncovering a historical narrative. We're reimagining our entire understanding of these border regions. As the first wave of collaborative research began to spread, the reactions were immediate and unprecedented. Researchers from different civilizations were comparing notes, challenging long-held assumptions, creating something entirely new. Captain Reyes looked out at the vast starscape. They had not solved the conflict through traditional means, but they had done something far more important. They had created the possibility of genuine transformation. Prepare the next communication sequence, she instructed. The real work of understanding was just beginning. The breaking point arrived not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a moment of profound silence. Captain Alina Reyes stood on the bridge of the U.S. Resolute, her hands clasped behind her back, watching as NeoVA compiled the most comprehensive diplomatic intervention in galactic history. Lieutenant Commander Aria Zhang monitored the communication networks, her fingers dancing across holographic interfaces that pulsed with unprecedented levels of interconnectivity. Preparing comprehensive narrative integration, NeoVA announced, its voice carrying a subtle undertone that might have been interpreted as anticipation. The communication sequence was unlike any diplomatic transmission in recorded history. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a compromise. It was a comprehensive deconstruction of the conflict itself, a meticulous breakdown of every layer of misunderstanding that had maintained the territorial dispute for generations. Dr. Camil Rodriguez had spent weeks preparing the transmission. Each data point had been carefully cross-referenced, each historical narrative contextualized, each economic dependency mapped with quantum-level precision. "We're not just presenting information," Rodriguez explained to the bridge crew. "We're creating a comprehensive ecosystem of understanding." The first wave of transmissions began to spread across communication networks. Independent researchers who had been systematically excluded from previous negotiations found themselves at the center of an unprecedented dialogue. Community leaders from border regions began sharing experiences that revealed more commonalities than differences. NeoVA ran complex social simulation models that demonstrated how the conflict had been maintained through carefully constructed narratives, economic structures, and political systems that benefited from continued tension. The artificial intelligence was doing more than simply collecting information. It was revealing the intricate social mechanisms that had perpetuated the dispute. Commander Zarek of the Cenorian Collective watched in a mixture of horror and fascination. The human vessel was not just presenting a diplomatic solution. It was fundamentally reimagining the entire concept of conflict resolution. They're treating a complex territorial dispute as a community dialogue, Lixna observed, her three eyes blinking in rapid succession. The U.S. Resolute's approach targeted the most fundamental aspect of the conflict, the narrative structures that had maintained it for generations. Each transmission was designed to challenge existing understanding, to reveal the complex interdependencies that had been deliberately obscured. Dr. Mira Konstantin and Dr. Zaxlin, researchers who had begun a collaborative project through the ship's cultural exchange, presented a groundbreaking archaeological study. Their research revealed that the contested border regions had a far more complex history than any single civilization had previously acknowledged. These territories were never simply a point of conflict, Mira explained during a live transmission that reached millions across different civilizations. They were a shared space of cultural exchange, economic interdependence, and mutual survival. The VEX Trade Consortium's economic analysts began running simulation models that revealed the massive inefficiencies created by the long-standing conflict. Resources that had been tied up in military posturing could be redirected into collaborative research and economic development. Captain Reyes understood the delicate nature of the intervention. This was not about imposing a solution, but about creating space for genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. Each carefully curated information package was designed to challenge existing narrative structures, to reveal the complex interdependencies that had been obscured by conflict. NeoVA projected a holographic representation of the emerging communication networks. Where previous interaction maps had been rigid and hierarchical, the new network looked like a living organism, complex, adaptive, constantly evolving. Psychological engagement is moving beyond simple curiosity. NeoVA reported, "We're detecting the emergence of new collaborative identities." The breaking point came during a live transmission that was simultaneously broadcast across multiple communication networks. It wasn't a dramatic speech or a formal declaration. It was a simple presentation of interconnected understanding, a comprehensive mapping of how the conflict had been maintained and how it could be transformed. Community leaders from border regions began sharing experiences that revealed more commonalities than differences. Researchers from different civilizations compared notes, challenging long-held assumptions, creating something entirely new. "We are not defining borders," Captain Reyes explained during the transmission. We are revealing connections. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of civilizations suddenly understanding that the boundaries they had fought over were more complex than they had ever imagined. It was the silence of recognition, of potential transformation. On the bridge of the U.S. Irresolute, Captain Rise looked out at the vast starscape. They had not solved the conflict through traditional means, but they had done something far more important. They had created the possibility of genuine transformation. Prepare the final communication sequence, she instructed. The most critical moment was yet to come. The final transformation began with a sound. It was not a grand declaration or a diplomatic pronouncement. Instead, it was the collective gasp of understanding that rippled across multiple communication networks simultaneously. The U.S. Resolute had done something unprecedented. It had created a moment of shared revelation that transcended traditional boundaries of conflict. Captain Alina Reyes stood on the bridge, her posture calm but charged with an energy of profound possibility. Lieutenant Commander Aria Zhang monitored the communication networks, her fingers moving with a precision that seemed to conduct the symphony of emerging understanding. Narrative integration at 97.3%. Nenovia reported, its voice carrying a subtle undertone that might have been interpreted as something close to excitement. The comprehensive communication package that the U.S. Resolute had been building for weeks was more than a diplomatic intervention. It was a living, breathing ecosystem of understanding that revealed the intricate mechanisms that had maintained the conflict for generations. Dr. Cumbel Rodriguez had become the unexpected architect of this transformation. His team had meticulously mapped the economic, cultural, and historical connections that had been deliberately obscured. Each data point was a thread in a complex tapestry of shared experience. "We're not resolving a conflict," Rodriguez explained to the bridge crew. "We're revealing a shared story that has been fragmented." The communication networks began to shift. Where once there were rigid boundaries between civilizations, now there were intricate pathways of mutual understanding. Researchers who had been positioned as opponents were now collaborating on projects that would have been unimaginable weeks earlier. Dr. Mira Konstantin and Dr. Zaxlin, whose collaborative archaeological research had become a symbol of this transformation, presented a groundbreaking study that reimagined the contested border regions. Their work revealed a shared history that was far more complex and interconnected than any single civilization had previously acknowledged. NOVA ran complex simulation models that demonstrated how the conflict had been maintained through carefully constructed narratives of separation. The artificial intelligence was doing more than collecting information. It was revealing the social mechanisms that had perpetuated misunderstanding. The VEX Trade Consortium was the first major economic entity to fully embrace the new paradigm. Their economic analysts revealed the massive inefficiencies created by generations of conflict. Resources that had been tied up in military posturing could now be redirected into collaborative research and development. Captain Reyes understood the delicate nature of this moment. This was not about imposing a solution, but about creating space for genuine dialogue and mutual understanding. Each carefully curated information package was designed to challenge existing narrative structures, to reveal the complex interdependencies that had been obscured. Commander Zarek of the Cenorian Collective watched the transformation with a mixture of wonder and fundamental reassessment. The human vessel had not conquered through military might or economic pressure. Instead, it had done something far more profound. It had created a framework for genuine understanding. "We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of conflict resolution," Zarek observed to Lixna, his longtime diplomatic advisor. "Not through force, but through comprehensive understanding." The artistic exchanges that had begun weeks earlier now took on a new significance. Musicians from different civilizations had created compositions that blended their unique cultural signatures. Visual artists had produced works that explored themes of migration, conflict, and reconciliation. These creative collaborations had done something that formal diplomatic channels never could. They had created emotional connections that transcended political boundaries. NOVA projected a holographic representation of the emerging communication networks. Where previous interaction maps had been rigid and hierarchical, the new network looked like a living organism, complex, adaptive, constantly evolving. Psychological engagement has moved beyond curiosity, the artificial intelligence reported. We are detecting the emergence of a new collaborative identity. The final transmission from the U.S. Resolute was not a declaration of victory or a formal resolution. It was an invitation, a comprehensive mapping of the connections that had always existed, but had been deliberately obscured by generations of conflict. We are not defining borders, Captain Reyes explained during the transmission. We are revealing connections. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of civilizations suddenly understanding that the boundaries they had fought over were more complex than they had ever imagined. It was the silence of potential, of transformation. Lieutenant Commander Zhang looked at the communication networks, no longer a series of rigid lines, but a living, breathing ecosystem of mutual understanding. They had not solved the conflict through traditional means, but they had done something far more important. They had created the possibility of genuine transformation. On the bridge of the U.S. Resolute, Captain Rice looked out at the vast starscape. The ship had become more than a diplomatic vessel. It was a testament to humanity's most profound capability, the ability to understand, to connect, to reimagine possibility. The universe would never be the same.